Yeah.
How you get there? Chairs over there. This is great. This is 10 times the turnout that we had last. This is 20 times the turnout we had last year. Last year we had 2 people. We did the same thing we did last year, so I don't know, but this is wonderful. So, I mean, this is kind of what I was hoping for. And let me just see if I managed to do the pages. And this is also, I found out the hard way that there are no classrooms available today because of the way they do things. So we were originally going to be in a different space. And that signals us time to begin. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. My name is Dr. Julia Osman. I'm the director of the Institute for the Humanities. This is a fabulous day. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm here with the 3 fellows who have been the faculty fellows for the Institute for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship for the past semester. There are snacks since we're doing this over lunchtime if you find yourself feeling peckish or needing a caffeine boost. The Institute for Humanities Fellowship was started last year, and it's an opportunity for faculty members, especially those in that kind of mired in service associate professor level, to have an opportunity to get a little bit more time to work on ongoing projects. You get a course release, and then you have kind of a built-in community with your fellow fellows. And we have been meeting every other week now for the whole semester just to check in, talk about difficulties with writing or choosing a publisher or getting through that difficult chapter or setting goals and holding each other accountable to them and things like that. So if you are interested in being an Institute for the Humanities Faculty Fellow, the applications are now open and they will be due August 25th. If this sounds like something that is for you. And so I'm just going to keep talking while the siren goes, so I don't hand it over to Ted while the siren is going. Also, just so you know, we are live streaming this. So it's just on my laptop. So it will just be pointed at each person who is presenting at that time, because the Institute for the Humanities is, everything we do is just about free and open to the public. So this way, anyone who couldn't make it to this room, but who still wants to see what the fellows have been working on, can tune in via our Facebook page. If you are tuning in live via our Facebook page, although Facebook hasn't told me if anyone's doing so yet, if you have a question for one of the panelists, just put it in the comment section beneath the video, and we'll be sure to include it in the conversation. All right, and I don't have anything else to say. Is there anything else I should be? Let me introduce the fellows to you. So the fellows this year, Dr. Ted Atkinson from the Department of English. Atkinson from the Department of English. He is, well, how do you say your name, Ted? This is Ted, everyone. I feel like we all know Ted. I feel like we all kind of know everyone in this room. Anyway, this is Ted from the Department of English, Associate Professor in the Department of English. He's been working on the TVA in novels for the past semester, and has a book manuscript that he's almost finished with on that. This is Anne Marshall. You all know Anne. Anne is, I think there are 2 chairs over there in the back. And I can go get some more. Anne is in the Department of History. You also, and what is your title with the Grant Library? Executive Director. Executive is also the, wow, that sounds so good. Is also the executive director of the, this makes me feel so fancy now that we had the executive director of the Grant Library as a fellow. Anne's been working on a biography of Marcius Cassius Clay. Cassius Marcellus Clay. Clearly, I've been paying very close attention to all of your projects this semester. And then we also have Saul. Saul, how do you say your last name? Velez. From the Department of Classical and Modern Languages and Literatures, who's been working on violence and women in literature. And she's working on a book manuscript on that and has made a lot of headway on some difficult chapters. So now that the siren has ceased, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you and turn my laptop in your direction so that you can go ahead and tell us in a few minutes what you've been working on.
Okay. I don't know why it's doing this. That's not what's showing up on my laptop screen, but I hope everybody can see the images. It wouldn't be a presentation without technological difficulties. First, I want to just say a quick thank you to Julia for facilitating all semester, and my other participants in the support group, Anne and Sol. It's been great to work with you as a fellow. Okay, so the project that I've been working on, the title is Monumental Designs, Infrastructure, and the Culture of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Uh, a focal point of this study is what you see here, the network of dams that were constructed in the Tennessee River Valley. I think I could have built a dam myself in the time it's taken to write this book. But these wind up in most of the, if not all of the works that I'm studying. They shape narratives, they shape characters' lives, they form images, they become project screens for projecting all sorts of things, depending on the narrative that I'm looking at or the image that I'm looking at. So I'm not sure everybody knows what exactly the TVA is, but it was formed as a federal corporation in 1933. That's a very unique designation. This was one of the New Deal agencies that was formed, you know, the sort of flurry of acronyms that came out of the early New Deal. And it covers most of Tennessee and 6 other southern states in part. So it's a pretty big area that's covered there. And the project, the aim of it was primarily rural electrification and flood control. That's what you hear most about, and that's why the hydroelectric dams get so much attention. It was also, though, it was an ambitious program that was also trying to address land management, things like soil conservation or agricultural practices, and also economic development, which it is still very much involved in fact, in partnerships with this university in some ways. So my project is essentially a cultural history of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and it engages mostly with infrastructure studies and also the energy humanities, or those are the 2 areas of work that I'm drawing most from and engaging with. So the study was really influenced by some questions of scale that have been going on in Southern literary and cultural studies, and people asking, how useful is it to keep thinking of the South defined in monolithic terms? And so a couple of things have been happening. People have been going wider, so like thinking of transatlantic connections or connecting to the global South and looking at the US South's position between sort of the global North and the global South in terms of development. There's also been an effort to go more local, though, to kind of scale down. And so I started thinking about what would it look like to think about the Tennessee Valley Authority as a sub-regional framework. And that was really one of the primary influences of the project. The other was Patricia Yeager, a literary scholar, when she was editor of PMLA, a Journal of Literary Studies. She started asking the question, what would it look like to organize literary and cultural periods around the energy sources that were primary at the time that they were produced? And so those 2 things together really started me thinking that the TVA would be a very interesting way to think about um, cultural history, really, as I said. So this study is divided into 5 chapters, and the first 3 chapters cover its visual culture. So I'm looking at photography, documentary photo books that became popular during the Great Depression and particularly under the New Deal agencies, a Museum of Modern Art exhibition that was treating TVA architecture as a form of modernism. And then I move on to look at documentary films. There are a couple of very influential films, particularly Per Lawrence's The River, that set a lot of standards and aesthetics and narrative for documentary filmmaking that we still see. The script for that is highly regarded as poetry. In fact, James Joyce called it one of the most beautiful forms of the poetic expression he ever heard, the script for a documentary film. And then also, and I'll get to this a little bit more in just a minute, living newspapers produced by the Federal Theater Project, and there's one in particular called Power that was developed specifically to promote the TVA. And then the final 2 chapters move on, move away from the works that were state sponsored, so like under the New Deal or in partnership with public institutions like MoMA or publishing houses that were publishing some of the documentary photo books. And so I have a chapter on fiction film. Elia Kazan's Wild River tells the story of a TVA agent who's trying to get a recalcitrant landowner to leave before the flood comes to make the reservoir. That's a kind of stock narrative that you see in works that feature the TVA. And then the final chapter is on TVA novels, and these are contemporary works. Well, one contemporary work, one from the 60s, as a kind of illustration of how these narratives of the flooding and the drowned town fiction, as one scholar calls it, how these shape various stories that form a sort of common set of novels that I'm looking at. And these works that are inspired more by the TVA, I'm saying serve as counter narratives. So they come in and sort of fill in the blanks, particularly the disruption and displacement that happened because of large scale construction. And so that's basically, there's also a coda, but I won't get into that right now. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes looking at one example from the study that I'm doing. So this is the living newspaper that I mentioned, a production that was done in 1937 or started in 1937. And it is part of the Federal Theater Project that was a New Deal agency, one of the arts agencies that was formed early on. And this image is, as you can see, the Ritz Theater. This is the premiere of Power, which was on February 23rd, 1937. So this is a little bit later in the New Deal decade, or at least the first decade of it. And so one of the things that I wanted to point out here and that I point out in the study is the way that before the audience is even going in, they're aware of electricity in terms of the lighting. One scholar talks about how electric lights were used in the city sort of to create texts where they were sort of shaping people's understanding and experience. And so just very quickly, Power, I'm really calling it a sort of allegory of electrification. It has characters whose names are farmer, wife, consumer, utilities officer. There's just all sorts of different characters who come onto the stage and are there primarily to generate sort of support for the TVA in particular, and to talk about issues that have to do with private utilities, public utilities, the debate over which was better for the American public at the time. And so here is an image of two of the actors from the New York production. This is farmer and wife. And one of the things that happens here is that there's a kind of consumer populism that runs through this production, and in this case, the wife is urging her husband to, quote, channel the spirit of Andy Jackson, in order to fight the private utilities and to make sure that people in rural areas could get wired and have electricity. And so my argument in this chapter is that the infrastructure, the grid, it has material capabilities and functions, but it's far more important for the purposes of this production to think about the symbolic meaning, the public meaning of infrastructure in this case. And so it's shaped as and presented as a conduit for national unity. So it's a way to bridge the rural-urban divide and to alleviate issues from uneven development that have been going on for decades. So the backward South is going to be brought into the progressive fold of the nation through rural electrification. That's the argument that's being made there. So the production toured around the country, and it's not surprising that it tended to go to places where the same debate was playing out, and places that were targeted for TVA style infrastructure of their own. So these are images from the Seattle production of Power, which happened also in 1937. And they stepped right into the middle of a public controversy, a political controversy between Seattle City Light, which was a cooperative, and Puget Power, which wanted to keep the monopoly on electrification at the time. And so Power comes in and stages this rousing endorsement of central planning and rural cooperatives that are providing electricity. And so it's really stepping into the debate. One thing that I wanted to point out here that I point out in the study is that it anticipates in a lot of ways what we would think of as these sort of multimedia displays. So there's scrims coming down and there's silhouettes used, and there's all this attention to lighting. They even shine the spotlight on the electric board that they're using for the lighting. So they're kind of making infrastructure visible. They want the audience thinking about where electricity comes from and how it gets there and what it can do. So it's interesting in that regard. It's sort of aesthetically dazzling, but basically propaganda. So you get a little bit of a mix there. To close out my part of this, I want at the end of the chapter that I have on power, I write about a 2009 revival of Power that was done in at the Metropolitan Playhouse in New York's East Village. And in the sort of discourse and the critics writing about this production, they really drew parallels between what was happening in the Depression and some of the issues that are playing out on the stage and the results of the financial crisis, of 2008 into 2009. So they're talking about these issues of central planning and what is the government's role, and this really strong endorsement of a strong federal presence that Power stages, okay? So at the end of Power, there's a song called the TVA song, which is essentially this kind of full-throated endorsement of the TVA model for rural electrification for economic development. And what I'm pointing out here in the chapter is that it's interesting that the critical discourse around this was focused on the financial crisis when just 3 months before this, in Kingston, at the Kingston fossil plant, which the TVA constructed in 1955, at the time it was the largest coal fire plant in the world, there had been a huge release, as they were calling it, of coal fly ash. So this sludge is coming out of a breach in the walls that were there to contain it. So this is a byproduct of coal fire combustion. And it releases something like 1.3 million cubic meters of this sludge across the Emory River into entire neighborhoods and farms, and just covers the entire place in coal sludge. And so this is happening just a few months before this revival of Power. And so the sort of discordance between this message that's going on the stage and the critics in New York focusing on the financial crisis, when a better example or a better sort of counterpoint to what's happening on stage, or at least a sort of corrective to it, would have been this issue, for people to pay attention to this. And so it gets into what I'm calling the sort of past energy futures, where it can help us as we try to imagine what our energy future is going to look like, to look back at past energy futures. How did people envision what the future of energy was going to be? And Power tells us that this idea of cheap, abundant, clean hydroelectricity for everyone, for as much as you wanted, was going to be the future. Bless their hearts.
Thanks, Ted. And I think Saul will be up next, and Ted, you're gonna put the thing.
Oh, so, well, I don't, okay.
It just doesn't like you, Ted.
It's doing the opposite now. It's showing what it was showing.
I have been working on this book for a long time, and I'm close to finish it. Thanks to the Institute for the Humanities Fellowship for giving my time to work on it. During this semester, I appreciated the advice and support of Julia Osman, who has always been able to help me to find a way to keep going. I also want to thank Anne and Ted, who gave me support and ideas to work, and Robert West, CMLL's new department head who supported this project. I want to thank Pete, Andrea, and Fumiko, who have been my guinea readers, and Julia is going to become one. Finally, thanks to those here today. Writing always involves exposure and vulnerability. And Julia, I thank you for offering us a space to share our work with you all. So today I will read you a part of my manuscript's introduction to give you the gist of the whole project. So you just keep
I'll look at
very fast.
Okay.
Before teaching Chicas Muertas, Dead Girls, by the Argentine writer and journalist Selva Almada, I warn my students that the text narrates misogyny, abuse, rape, and femicide. Once a student let me know that these topics triggered her. I asked whether she wanted another option, yet she decided to go through the reading and discussions. In class, it was clear that the text was singularly violent for her. She could have chosen to read another work, but she ended up writing 2 papers. Teaching that book, I wonder what we do when we read, teach, and write about violence. What happens when we expose students to violence? Why we do so, and with what effects? The same can be pondered about writers and their books. This type of question is central to my project on Latin American literature entitled Suspending Latin American Hegemonic Narratives. In this tradition, the political task of literature frequently was shaped by the building of identity and representation of authenticity. Thus, imagination in Latin American literature figure images to build national and continental identities. The letter C expressed through its writing mainly 3 primary modeling impulses: independence, originality, representativity. During the 20th century, fiction was endowed with the implicit political task of building the image of the nation and the ethical task of denouncing injustice and redeeming its people. But, as Alberto Moreira notes, modernity's critical reason and the regional project of Latin Americanism that grounded itself on it have been exhausted. The binary humanist tradition of the West and its notion, identity, nation, people, sovereignty, are being contested and criticized. Thus, in the last 20 years, violences have come to be illuminated related to gender, drugs, migration, and neoliberalism. They break national populist scenarios and present more regional, marginal areas or transnational scenarios. Considering this shift, I focus on 2 types of violence: the violence of the torture chamber and the violence against women, particularly femicide. I explore the weaving and unweaving of sovereignty, imagination, gender, and violence through reading of Juan José Saer, Angélica Gorodischer, Roberto Bolaño, Seba Almada, and Cristina Rivera Garza. These texts deal with the violence of dictatorship and femicide, the emergence and consolidation of the neoliberal market, and the globalization of the principle of general equivalence. I explore how these texts engage in a self-reflective critique of how, why, and with what effect these authors write about violence. Saer y nadie... Saer y Nadie Nada Nunca, and Gorodischer in Tumba de Jaguares, delve in the limits of narrating torture by critiquing sovereign touch and imagination. Both texts critique the logic of sovereignty in politics and literature. Saer allows us to critique both the Argentine military fantasy of sovereign touch and the populist narrative of heroic sacrifice. Gorodischer criticizes the authority and fantasy of the torturers and the author's sovereign imaginations through a feminist rewriting of literature history and the constructions of literature's room. Bolaño in 2666 and Almada in Dead Girls narrate violence against women in its most extreme form, femicide, while weaving the minor violence of everyday structure and misogyny. Both chronicle the continuum of violence against women that end in femicide and feminicide. Both destabilize the hierarchy of political violence as being more important than minor violence against women. Both focus on the minor to tell the stories. These texts focus on how to narrate violence without confirming the authority and the author's imagined sovereignty. By questioning the author's authorities, these texts also force us to question our own authority as critics. Our drive towards appropriation and the violence we do in our readings. Thus, in the end, I read Rivera Garza's El Mal de Taiga to find a possible model to perform and imagine the tensions of reading in aporetic renunciation of our own authority as critics and readers. Axiomatically, I propose 2 maxims. On the one hand, you ought to tell violence, and on the other hand, you must respect care for the singularity of the victim. The 2 maxims, one ought to tell about violence, one must respect the singularity of the victim, enter into conflict as shown by Almada's Chicas Muertas. These texts about violence, women, and femicide tell us about violence and expose the audience, and many times the victims themselves, to violence. As Almada shows, it is imperative to denounce sexual abuse, speak about that violence, and make it visible to stop and uproot it. But what happens when the victim has been killed and cannot speak anymore? How does one voice their stories? Does one imagine being them? Does one keep the distance between the narrator and the victim? And if the victim is alive, The victims of gender and sexual abuse may not be able or want to speak about their experiences in a prescriptive manner at that moment. Moreover, how do we respect the fear of the other if it results from direct oppression or ingrained patriarchal values without direct oppression? The victims mumbling, murmur, rumoring, or silence, must be respected in all its shattering, inconsistent, or both. If the power to silence the victim is evident, how do we stop the violence? How do we do justice to the whispering or silence? How can we accompany the victim? What happens to those being exposed to the narrated violence? These questions emerge when reading Almada's text. As the letter of the text insists, we cannot not tell about the violence, even when we know that talking might do violence to the reader or the victim again. The very victim speaking about violence faces the same conundrum. For Diane Taylor, the question is not whether one should tell about violence or not, but how we narrate violence. We need to go further and suspend the question of telling violence. We cannot not tell about violence. The double negation marks a space where the thought of how to speak is not answered in a normative manner, but it can be explored. For example, Angelica Godoy's in Tupa de Jaguares confronts us with a father who cannot stop imagining the torture of his disappeared daughter, but does not want to share his pain, doesn't want to mourn. Roberto Bolaño in 2666 refuses to ventriloquize the victims of femicide in Santa Teresa, Ciudad Juárez, engaging in a syncopated account of victims one by one, showing the objectification of the victims in the forensic descriptions, while at the same time destabilizing them and opening the question of their singularity. Almada in Chicas Muertas orients us towards an ethics of the minor, by listening to rumors and secrets, but also silences and gaps in the communication of violence. In these writings, we can see the tensions between the maxim of speaking out, telling the violence, and the one of respecting the victim's singularity, even if you are the victim. Therefore, I state the maxim in the double negative, not the positive. Those negatives give a pause to look at others' violence, to think of alternatives, not to become saviors, not to reproduce narrative of heroes or sacrificial victims, but to begin dismantling hierarchies and not become hierarchically connected to the other, and thus share our singularity and freedom with others. In a nutshell, suspending Latin American hegemonic narratives intervene by interrupting certain critical narratives that focus on normative, ethical, and political tasks of literature. Chapter 1 traces the construction and suspension of national allegories with sacrificial narratives by marking the distance within and between the singular and the political body. Chapter 2 analyzes how the task of imagining what happens in the dark chamber of the torturer and the task of mourning of post-dictatorship enters into an abyssal melancholic loop that shows the elliptical suspension of sovereign imagination. Chapter 3 explores how the task of counting violence in a realistic manner and of denouncing global neoliberalism is suspended by either delaying and bantering strategies or by intermittently discontinuing the chain of equivalences, the series of dead women that make possible the global totality. Chapter 4 pursues and suspends the task of building a positive female identity and allows us to ask what being a woman is if one is not what the killers want. Finally, the conclusions perform the very tensions of the traditional task of the literary critic: appropriation, expropriation, metaphorization, and naturalization, and the singularizing drive of letting be, demetaphorize, denarrativize. Accordingly, in a figural sense, the manuscript traces the denarrativization of the field of Latin American literature, which is to say, it traces the interruptions of the assumptions and ethical tasks that have organized the field, such as the task of allegorically denouncing the state violence, the task of mourning, the task of making violence visible, the task of narrativizing it, and the task of imagining it. The dark chamber of the torturer, the future, the community, all of which are ultimately linked to the political task of identity and community building. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I'd also like to echo my thanks to the Institute for Humanities and the College of Arts and Sciences for supporting this, because this is I think, a sort of unusual fellowship, at least in our institution, to support a project, a second project towards the end. I think typically projects get supported more towards the beginning. The idea is, you get a sabbatical or some other fellowship where you can go off and research, but it's, the writing part can be hard to finish up, and the fact that we have this fellowship that supports that, I think, is really unique and wonderful. So, and I've had a great semester with Julia and Sol and Ted, and yeah, it's been a great experience. So, my current book project profiles the prominent Kentucky anti-slavery reformer Cassius Marcellus Clay. So I want to see a show of hands. How many of you have heard of this Cassius Marcellus Clay? Not Muhammad Ali. Besides, someone other than myself prattling on about my work. So, okay, a couple of people have. Okay, not bad. So I like to sort of lovingly refer to him, or scathingly refer to him, as a sort of B-list historical character today, because he kind of pops out in a bunch of random places. But in his own time, Clay was a well-known character who captured the imaginations of 19th century Americans. He was all over the newspapers. And of course, people read the newspaper a lot more frequently than they do today. So Clay rose to fame in the 1840s and 1850s as a young slave-holding politician from a slave state who opposed slavery. And while his outspoken views outraged many of his fellow white Kentuckians, they intrigued and inspired people all over the nation. So the idea of a privileged slave owner turning his back on the very system of labor which supported his lifestyle was remarkable to a lot of people, as was the fact that he dared to challenge the system from inside a slave state. And likewise, the measures to which he resorted when doing so were extraordinary. First, there was a well-publicized duel in 1841 with a political rival. Then came a knife fight at a political rally in 1843, during which he sliced off his attacker's ear. When Clay decided to start his own anti-slavery newspaper in Lexington, which was in the heart of the slaveholding bluegrass region, he fortified his printing office with Mexican lances, lead panels, and 2 4-pounder cannons. After only 2 months of publication, however, a pro-slavery mob managed to dismantle the True American's office anyway. But this garnered him all kinds of sympathy and support from the national Northern anti-slavery community, which saw this as a breach of free speech, and they lavished him with praise and sympathy. But their goodwill soon dissipated when only months later, Clay enlisted in the Mexican-American War, a conflict he had previously denounced as a pro-slavery fight. Then in 1849, he made national headlines again when he defended himself with a Bowie knife at a political rally, this time killing his assailant. Well, adding to his incongruities was the fact that he really garnered a lot of adulation and credibility for manumitting his own slaves at great personal expense. In reality, at the same time as he was freeing 9 individuals in 1845, he was simultaneously pressing murder charges against another of his enslaved laborers, a woman named Emily, on the grounds that she had poisoned his infant son. When a jury acquitted her, Clay sold Emily and 3 of her family members to a slave dealer in the Deep South. Most people remained unaware then or even now that he never manumitted all of his enslaved laborers, as the press often gave him credit for doing. He actually retained anywhere between 10 and 15 bondspeople between 1845 and the end of the Civil War, because they were entailed to his estate through his father's will. And so this was even after the Emancipation Proclamation, because he lived in Kentucky, which of course was exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, in the 1850s, Clay turned his attention to national anti-slavery politics, and he joined the Free Soil Party, which then fed into the Republican Party, which he was a founding member of in 1854. And he canvassed tirelessly for Republican candidates between 1854 and 1860. So all the while, he continued to be this inspiration for an increasing number of white Americans who believed that slavery was limiting their own chances for upward mobility. So if a man who had been and so was a slave owner could attest so powerfully and with such conviction to the economic evils of the peculiar institution, then there was hope that there might be other white Southerners lurking, underneath the hegemonic control of white slaveholders in the South that also might see the light. So Clay's name appeared on the vice presidential ballot in 1860, but he lost a place on the ticket to Hannibal Hamlin. But to reward him for his service to the party, Abraham Lincoln appointed him minister to Russia, which was a post that he held intermittently until 1869. But when he returned to the United States in 1869, Clay did a political about-face and spurned the party he helped launch. With slavery gone, he felt free to criticize Republicans for their purported corruption and for their Reconstruction policies in the South. He first joined the ranks of the breakaway liberal Republicans in 1872, and then the Democratic Party after that. And as a Democrat, he advocated for the removal of U.S. military troops from southern states and a return to quote unquote home rule. He actually even came down to the Mississippi Delta during the infamously corrupt and violent political campaign of 1875 to help his nephew win an election to the state legislature, who's running as a redeemer. So as thrilling and unpredictable as Cassius Clay's anti-slavery career was, by the end of his long life, he had actually grown more infamous. And he was born in 1810, died in 1903. So he had a very long life. By the end of it, he was much more famous for his personal foibles. His stint in Russia was marred by his association with a St. Petersburg madam. And while he was there, he also developed a fondness for ballerinas, and a dalliance with one of them may have resulted in a Russian orphan who came to live with him at his Kentucky estate in the early 1870s. Not surprisingly, a scandalous divorce from his long-suffering wife, Mary Jane, followed that. And all of this would have counted as enough drama for a lifetime, but Clay emerged in the national press during his later years when at the age of 84, he married a 15-year-old girl who worked in his household. And that marriage ended as it had begun, quickly and surrounded by sensationalistic press coverage. So given Clay's rather extraordinary life, you might be surprised to know that my main contention in this book is that rather than being unique, Cassius Clay was in fact very representative, that he embodied mainstream anti-slavery thought. And he typified the philosophy and strategy of most Americans who opposed slavery before the Civil War. So basically, I'm trying to take somebody who is intrinsically interesting and make him boring and banal. That's what good historians do, right?
Yay.
But this typical, typicality, I guess you'd say, was really manifested in why and how Clay, and not just Clay, but his compatriots, his more famous compatriots, even opposed slavery, and how they behaved when slavery ended. So modern Americans often assume that opponents of slavery before the Civil War understood slavery as we do today as a moral and ethical wrong. It's wrong to hold property in human beings and deprive them of their basic freedom. And certainly there were some famous abolitionists who were motivated by this reasoning, and abolitionists certainly exerted an outsized influence on the moral conscience of American society, but they really did not represent the vast majority of whites who opposed slavery before the Civil War. Though there were some white Americans who had ethical qualms about human bondage, by and large, their larger concern was slavery's negative effect on the economic opportunity of white Americans and the attendant political representation of non-holding slaveholding whites. In other words, it deprives, northern whites, Midwestern whites, people who are looking to move out into new territories that will become new states, of a solid chance to access land and to work for a fair wage, not to have to compete with enslaved labor that's not getting paid, right? And also, you know, to basically hold political power relative to those free states. This book also highlights that the philosophy and strategy of fighting slavery was intrinsically conservative. So while immediate abolition was and has been correctly viewed as being a radical point of view, the anti-slavery theory and strategy espoused by Cassius Clay and his anti-slavery compatriots, including some of the major political anti-slavery thinkers of the day, people like Salmon P. Chase, Horace Greeley, William Seward, and even Abraham Lincoln, was intrinsically conservative. These people hewed to the conservative commitment of to both property rights and to state sovereignty. These were two concepts, as we know, that are enshrined within the U.S. Constitution. And their understanding, which was shared by most white Americans in the antebellum and Civil War eras, was that slavery was a constitutionally protected form of property that could be done away with only by individual states. And so this really informed the parameters of their thinking, as well as really limited the range of their actions. And so basically also what I think it does too is these through lines, this commitment to both property rights and state sovereignty also continues through the Civil War into Reconstruction, where it becomes the basis of a lot of these people who had been dedicated anti-slavery activists before the war and during the war, turning their back on the process of Reconstruction, during which, you know, the federal government, people in the federal government are trying to secure, and in the southern states are trying to secure the rights, right, that have been imparted by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And they see the application of federal force interference, as they would put it, basically using the federal military to make sure that there's free and fair elections, to have the Freedmen's Bureau, to crush the Ku Klux Klan. All of these measures as the sort of heavy hand of federal government, right, that is overriding the rights of state sovereignty. And so what it does is it shows that the same conservative adherence to constitutional principles that limited the parameters that these anti-slavery actions before the war really restricted the lengths to which most American voters and politicians would go to ensure Black freedom out of it, after it. And so they really feel like returning the rights to Confederate states trumps the rights of African Americans. So none of the points I just mentioned are any new news to historians, probably maybe not even to y'all, but they are for a lot of people, a lot of sort of lay readers, most Americans, certainly the undergraduates and sometimes even the graduate students that we teach. But one of the things that I'm really hoping to do that is new is to try to explain how, when, and why these important differences between abolitionism, which we tend to conflate today with anti-slavery, why the important differences between abolitionism and mainstream political anti-slavery collapsed in the 19th century, why the distinctions that were there by the end of the 19th century were just unrecognized. And so that's what I'm hoping to do. And there's 2 points I want to just sort of point out as to the sort of prevalence of this misunderstanding that have to do with Cassius Clay and the link to the more famous Cassius Clay, who would become Muhammad Ali. So one example is in 2016, when Muhammad Ali passed away, Bob Costas, the sports announcer, got on national television and decried the fact that that Muhammad Ali had, quote, renounced his slave name, because that's what he did in 1964 when he, when he changed his name. He said, getting rid of my slave name. And Costas sort of pushed back against this by saying, the original Cassius Clay was an abolitionist, and he was a freedom fighter, and he was a fighter for equality, right? And that's the view of a lot of people, including radio host and Washington Post or Wall Street Journal columnist Michael Medved, who just less than 2 years ago wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal called "Americans Should Know More" or should know the story of abolitionist Cassius Clay. And he starts out, in an era of racial reckoning, the U.S. seems determined to obliterate statues and other public honors for those such as Confederate generals who fought to preserve slavery and racism. But there's no countervailing effort to remember or honor those who risked everything: career, wealth, prominence, and personal safety to promote emancipation. Then after giving a sort of summary of Clay's life, similar, but more selective than the one I just gave you, he closes with, "It's easy enough to sympathize with Ali's sentiments," thinking about renouncing his slave name. But for America today, it makes little sense to devote so much energy to dismantling the memory of pro-slavery notables, while colorful and important anti-slavery figures like the original Cassius Clay remain, for the most part, invisible, unknown, and unhonored. So I'm trying my best to make Cassius Clay less invisible and less unknown, but I don't think anyone's going to accuse my book of honoring him. So.
Thank you.
So we've got a little bit of time for questions. Questions for any of our panelists?
Ted, have you explored or used as a comparison other performance-related stuff? Like, I'm thinking of Woody Guthrie being hired to talk about industrial development in the Northwest, from which we get songs like the Big Grand Coulee Down, or from a capitalist perspective, post-World War II, there were a whole slew of industrial musicals which often get forgotten, praising the latest Ford or whatever thing coming out of the factories.
Well, music was actually going to be another chapter of this, but it just got to be too unwieldy. And so, because a lot of like I was mentioning, the TVA song that comes at the end of that Living newspaper, that started out as a folk song near the Clinch River and Norris Dam area, and got sort of appropriated and rewritten and used for the purpose of promoting the TVA. So essentially becoming propaganda. It was something I was thinking about, but in the interest of sort of reining it in, I've had to sort of let that go.
Are there any, say, Native American narratives as well? Because one of the classic tropes of dams is that they destroy Native American historic lands, their traditional fisheries.
Yeah, so I have a chapter that it focuses on Leah Kazan's Wild River. I think I mentioned that, the fiction film, and it channels a lot of what we see in these narratives is an appropriation of the rhetoric and the narratives of removal. So families talk about, we're being removed, we're being forced off our land. It's just like the 19th century. And so what happens is that the indigenous population in that entire history gets whitewashed as there's an appropriation of this. And so I have a kind of ending section of the chapter where I'm focusing on some indigenous writers who particularly did editorials. They would write letters to the editor. And one letter in particular was very striking to me, because she talks about wanting to write poetry, and she said that, how do you throw poetry at a dam? And sort of this feeling of helplessness. And that was referring to the Tellico Dam, which actually submerged several Cherokee sites and the village of Tanasi, which was where Tennessee comes from. So it winds up under a reservoir where people are now water skiing and all of this. And so that is a huge part of it, but it doesn't make it into the mainstream sort of cultural works that I'm focusing on, but I always try to bring it in as an important part and an answer to some of the absences in those works.
That's a non-single question. What's the most challenging part of this project, right, of getting into the research please? Because I know we as historians always face those walls, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, part of it was just figuring out what the project was, and I really resisted the idea of writing a biography for a long time because historians kind of have a conflicted relationship with biography. We oftentimes associate them with, not particularly analytical work on popular figures that, really sells well in front of a Barnes and Noble, but doesn't really tell us more about the broader historical time in which the people live. And so, yeah, and then also trying to figure out what it was about Cassius Clay that was, could tell us that, right? And so that took me a long time because it sort of started off as a different project. And then people kept asking, well, why don't you just write about Cassius Clay? Because I was writing about he and his brother. And then finally I was like, why are people so in love with this guy? Like, why does he have such a grip on people? Which, I mean, I guess is fairly evident, but like, I think the story is in the way they misremember him. And so once I realized that, then I got going on that. The other thing that's challenging is that a lot of his papers, so all of his personal correspondence before 1864 burned in a fire set by Confederates on his home in Kentucky. And so I'm missing a lot of, I'm missing a lot of correspondence. There's a lot in other, I corresponded with a lot of other famous people, so I can find his letters in their papers, but I can't really, that's tough, but just, a lot of newspaper stuff out there and some other primary source material, so.
And as you're trying to correct the story of Clay, like, how did it get told so wrong? Have you figured like the path from his actual life to the sort of mythology?
Yeah. So a lot of it, there was some general misremembering in general going on about abolition and anti-slavery towards the, and the sort of difference between the two by the end of the 19th century. But with Clay himself, it's pretty easy to trace. There was this sort of amateur historian, who's actually really a lawyer and a raconteur, who gave a talk at the Chicago Civil War Roundtable, which for people who don't know is like when a bunch of Civil War buffs get together and eat, like rubbery chicken and listen to talks about the Civil War. They have them all over the place, but and that was back in the 1930s. And he gave this just story about called the Lion of Whitehall, which is what Clay's nickname became. And it was a great yarn, but it became the basis and it was just wildly inaccurate. And it just became the basis for a bunch of books that came after. And I mean, people have there's only one reputable biography, and that was written in the early 1950s. But there have been tons of, sort of terrible biographies that are just, inaccurate. But I mean, one was written by the actor who played Jaws and in Goldfinger, was it Goldfinger? I mean, just like, all kinds of amateur writers taking him on. And they use this kind of misinformation as their basis. And so it just keeps getting repeated and repeated. So.
Gotta fix it in. Rewriting like the popular historiography, like that's quite a
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Joey.
Ted, I have a million questions for you, and I'm really excited about your project. I'll limit it to one, but I also have a question for Ann, so I'm gonna.
You've got, I'm giving you 6 minutes.
Cool. All right. So briefly, Ted, could you just explain what you think is like the strength of this sub-regional framework? Because as you suggested, so much of what we think about in terms of expanding where we see the South, how we see the South globally, et cetera, wants us to see like a South writ large. And I'm wondering what this sub-regional approach can tell us. Are you talking about like, you know, a South writ small? Are you talking about a nation writ small or?
I'm talking about a South writ small, a nation writ small, and a globe writ small, because one of the advantages, I think, and this project has kept revealing all of these different ways that things that we associate with the South, like a prime example is the Southern agrarians, big surprise, were not huge fans of the Tennessee Valley Authority, although they were divided. I mean, they weren't in lockstep against it. But one thing that we tend to think about is that Southern agrarian idea of the backward glance, and like backwardness keeps getting associated with it. It's a sort of nation's region argument. But what was interesting to me is that the TVA is using this part of the South and saying, this is a forward glance that we're staging. And this is a site of futurity. And so I think that's something that comes into view with a more localized framework, instead of just continuing to sort of talk about the larger kind of conceptions of the South monolithically defined, I guess. Does that make sense?
That's great. I'd love to talk more about it.
And then there's also these global connections that happen because the TVA is exported, the model is exported around the world, and officials serve as consultants. And so we start seeing novels that look just like the TVA novels coming out in India and other places. So.
Awesome. Can I do one for him real quick? He's probably very evident already, but so you're talking about memory and you've said misremembering a lot. Is this in some way a continuation of your previous work about memory?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely like, I think once you're a historian of memory, you always are, because you can't not think about how people remember and misremember.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. That's all, Julie.
Okay, good. We're good. We still have time for at least one or two more questions. Yeah.
So what would you see as the difference in definition between femicide and feminicide, or isn't there that much?
Well, femicide is a concept that was coined by Diana Russell that was trying to go from homicide to femicide and trying to visibilize that these killings were not just like random killings, but were killings that were targeting women in particular, or like bodies that were like recognized as a female. No, and so like the definition of like femicide is the killing of women because of being women, no, basically. And this term was like kind of like appropriated and reworked in the context of Ciudad Juarez killing of women since 1994. And it was like also reappropriated by the OEA. In fact, I don't know how you say OEA in English. The Organization of States in Latin America. I think so. It's like the ONU, but for Latin America, and where like they do put like femicide as a crime. So feminicide is like a term that was like coined by Lagarde and Fragoso, who were the first ones in studying the femicide in Latin America and in Ciudad Juarez, where like 400 women were like, you know, killed in a range of like 10 years, which is like more or less 2 to 4 women per month, like officially, and officially there are more. So no, and what they are like trying to put with feminicide is like, first I say it's a better translation, feminicidio in Espanol, that femicide, but also they want to put like the accent in the systemic role of the state to allow and tolerate those killings, you know, because particularly in Ciudad Juarez, the state has been like an accomplice of violence by not investigating, by like for example, after 5 years, they decide to burn all the evidence because they have not been working with that and it stinks. So they burn all all the evidence that they have of all the crimes. They do this kind of thing. So they are trying to put that, they say it's like more accurate as a concept for the singular case of Ciudad Juarez in Mexico or Latin America. Like in general, most of the people use them as synonyms. But it's like a big debate. They fight about this a lot.
Okay, well, that's all we have time for. So let's thank our panelists. Just so you know, this now concludes the your Institute for Humanities Fellowship, so congratulations. Each of you will get, because I know that you've worked very hard and you deserve big, fat, important prizes. So each of you is going to walk away with an Institute for Humanities coffee tumbler. The highly coveted, another reason to apply for the fellowship. So thank you all very much. Feel free to help yourself to snacks on the way out, and there are some Institute for Humanities stickers on the table too. Or, you know, like your phone and things. You're welcome.
We also owe you a paragraph.
Yes.
You also owe me paragraphs, yeah, but I was gonna, give you a little, until the end, until the official end of semester for that. Yeah, so anyway, so you get to get, and it's Super Humanities coffee tumbler. I'm sure you have all kinds of brand paraphernalia in your office, but this is better. What? I said, I'm sure you have all kinds of brand paraphernalia in your office, but this is much better. I know, it's high class, high class. Thank you, department head, for being supportive of the fellowship. Yes.
You know, situated here.